Our next guest coming in, you will certainly remember, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who played a key role in the 2019 impeachment hearings, the first of then-President Donald Trump, providing testimony on Trump's dealings with Ukraine. He was, in fact, the director for European Affairs on the National Security Council, listened in to that call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. In it, Trump pushed Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden's son Hunter in exchange for U.S. military assistance. And Vindman reported the call to his superiors, testifying twice in front of Congress, once behind closed doors, once publicly, which, of course, we carried live and which you doubtless saw. So there is the background. He's now no longer with the Army. He's retired, and he is now a doctoral student and senior fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is my guest from Woodbridge, Virginia this morning. A pleasure to meet you, and thank you for being a guest on our program this morning.
Thanks, Heather.
So many question lines for you, sir, but let me begin with what I was just mentioning in the introduction to you. Militarily speaking, let's start with day 6 in this war. The attacks seem to be hitting harder. You've seen what's happened in Kharkiv and what we are seeing with that convoy moving toward Kiev. How do you assess the situation on the ground right now?
From a strategic standpoint, what we see is a pivot from the failed assumptions, the fact that the Russian forces would be welcomed into Ukraine with open arms, and this would be a peacekeeping operation, to a war. So now the Russians, having failed to achieve their objectives through a somewhat light touch, I mean, that light touch included aerial bombardments and cruise missile strikes, are now going back to their kind of standard fare of attacking population centers to degrade the morale of the population, to punish the population for supporting the Ukrainian military. And that's why you see these devastating, heinous attacks on cities, that there are no military value. There's no real military value there except to punish the population. But overall,
sorry, I was just going to say, with that coming, with that convoy moving in, for example, the fact that the decapitation, as it was called, hasn't happened as quickly or as easily as perhaps Putin expected. The concern is that he will literally pulverize the cities and the people. What do you think?
There's it's very unfortunate, but there's a very good chance that he's going to resort to those tactics. That column is disturbing. We've been seeing that column move for probably about 48 hours and keep building, but it's also a bottleneck. It's also a very, very high payoff target. So those jets that are now being transferred over from Poland, Slovakia, and Bulgaria, once those get fueled and prepped, they're going to punish that convoy. There are some other troubling developments with just advances on other fronts. On the south, that has been probably the most successful military thrust. That's the one that's now encircled the city, besieged city of Mariupol just about. I think there's still some access to Ukraine, but it's surrounded from the Sea of Azov from the east and from the west. And the Russians are going to try to take that. That's an important strategic target because it helps build a land bridge from Russia to Crimea. The thrust on the east to the second largest city of Kharkiv, that's kind of stalled out. And then, of course, the operations that are threatening Kiev. But the Russians are reorganizing. They're redrawing their plans on valid assumptions, military assumptions of significant resistance, and they're going to continue to press. It's clearly not going to be something that plays out in the course of hours or even days. It might be weeks, and it's unfortunately going to be a devastating war with these visuals of civilian suffering pouring in across the world. That is going to be enormous pressure on Vladimir Putin. Sanctions are going to start to weigh in. The casualty rates for Russia are enormous, somewhere on the order of, according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, 5,700 dead. Yes. That is a third of the total of all the killed in 10 years of war in Afghanistan.
Can I just pause on the pressure and the tactics or the aspects that may indeed put pressure on Vladimir Putin at this point? But I do want to ask you about something, one more question about a military issue. And one of the things that's concerning, not just in the people, the troops moving in, but the weapons that Putin and Russia seem to be choosing to do so. We had someone on our program yesterday from Bellingcat talk about the cluster bombs, the cluster munitions being used in Kharkiv normally, those on civilian targets. But there are also reports of thermobaric weapons or vacuum bombs, and I think you probably would understand them much more than I. They're just sort of one shy of nuclear weaponry. They actually suck in the oxygen from the surrounding air when they go off, and they're extraordinarily lethal. They were been used in Chechnya, but there is some, we're looking at pictures here, a CNN team near the Ukrainian border just the other day got a picture of what looks to be a launcher for one of these Russian thermobaric multiple rocket launchers. Now, if that enters the fray, can you just speak to that? Would he actually use, how do you assess the threat of using something like that?
Yes, very high likelihood. This is a very, very powerful weapon. It's called a TOS-1. It fires this basically fire bombs. And the reason it's so devastating is it has effects on material. So it'll destroy things, tanks, buildings, but it also is really, really costly on human life because this is going to be graphic. But what it does is basically vacuums up the lungs, the air in somebody's lungs. And so anybody in the vicinity of this will be a casualty, a catastrophic casualty. It's going to inflict a lot of human, it's going to be a heavy human toll. I've seen these things fired in demonstrations when I was serving in Russia at military demonstrations. They are a very, very potent weapon, and it's more than likely going to be used. More than likely. I mean, that is just chilling to think about. But even more so are the nuclear threats, sir, in that we got the word from Putin placing nuclear deterrence on special high alert, as he did on Sunday. Now, the U.S. and President Biden have publicly discounted that threat as essentially sabre-rattling or bluster on Russia's part. Again, how do you assess that situation and potential? That's accurate. It's something that should be taken seriously and not discounted, and I'm certain that the Biden administration is doing that. But it's also should be understood for what it really is. It's nuclear saber-rattling. It's an intent to pressure the Ukrainians to capitulate. It's an intent to pressure the West to give up on these sanctions, to pressure Putin to end this war. And it should be taken as such. The fact is that there's a long precedence of the Soviet Union, and Vladimir Putin's a product of the Soviet Union. He's a KGB officer, and Russia also are using this tool to warn off the West. We are smart to it. We're going to be careful. We understand the risks, but we're not going to be intimidated. We're going to stand up for our interests, for our rights. We're going to stand up for the Ukrainian people that are defending our freedoms, even though we're thousands of miles away. I'm wondering what you think, in the face of that, the proper response from the West is. Joe Biden has said, and other NATO nations have said, there will be no troops on the ground. So they've gone to that level already, made it clear from the outset. So there's no really room to move. Is the kind of lethal, non-lethal aid that's coming from the West now enough? Or, in your estimation, do they need to commit troops to the fight? Well, you just raised, Heather, exactly. You just raised exactly the right point, which is we have no place to go. There's no, we can't go further back because we don't have troops on the ground. So that's why this is another indicator that this is bluster, and that it's not like he's trying to warn off U.S. Troops from going in or NATO troops from going in. That's not happening. So we could frankly be a little bit more thoughtful about what the real motivation is. With regards to support, it is something that should be carefully considered. Our firm position was no troops on the ground. That might not hold in reality. That's why I was a little bit troubled by those early, declarations of no troops. We might find ourselves in a position where the human toll is so catastrophic, like it was in the Balkans or it was in other locations, that we may want to put some troops on the ground, even to establish a humanitarian corridor or a limited no-fly zone. That has to be carefully managed because of the risks of escalation. But we should be doing everything we can to transfer weapons to Ukraine to defend itself. And some of that's going on with the Soviet-era Warsaw Pact equipment. But unmanned aerial vehicles, I wrote an article yesterday for the Washington Post about transferring more unmanned aerial vehicles to strike deep targets. So these rockets that flew into Kharkiv, they're being fired from Russian territory and Belarusian territory. Those need to be destroyed. And those need to be destroyed by Ukrainian forces operating their planes, operating transferred unmanned aerial vehicles. And there's no real risk of escalation there because it's the Ukrainians that are imposing the damage. But the time may come. This is the whole misconception or mistake about how this is going to be a limited war. It's the largest country in Europe. It's a major war, the largest war in Europe since the Second World War. And we had some wishful thinking about this would be a limited operation, and it wouldn't bring in NATO or bring in U.S. or Canada.
I was going to highlight your Washington Post piece and also the piece you wrote in The Atlantic. You've written so interestingly about the failures that led to the situation on the ground right now. And that's a subject for another conversation, I think, because there's much before us right at this moment to deal with the crisis at hand in Ukraine. So I'm wondering, as someone who has observed Vladimir Putin for years, the commentary I was listening to yesterday across the board pretty much assessing his psychological state, whether he's increasingly isolated or paranoid or perhaps, changed, a madman, essentially. What do you think of him right now, and whether or not there's any chance of responding to the kinds of pressures that you mentioned from a Russian public, which is feeling increasingly strangled because of the economic measures, by the oligarchs who are now speaking out publicly exceptionally? Is there anything that will move Vladimir Putin? Who is he right now?
Those are long-term. Nothing is likely to move him in the next days, or maybe it's possible, but the pressure probably isn't sufficient from the local population feeling the brunt of the economic sanctions to build. That's going to have to result in massive protests across the country. The oligarchs are largely neutered. I think they're going to join in when they see the population swing in a particular direction. I think the siloviki, these power actors from the various ministries, those are going to have to come in with more thoughtful and provocative or challenging advice to him that he's picked a course of catastrophe. But these things are likely to bear out over the course of days and weeks, not the next several hours. We'll see some indicators of Russia more flexible based on their negotiating position. They'll take less maximalist positions when they engage with the Ukrainians. But Vladimir Putin is the same guy he's been since basically the beginning. The only thing that's changed is that he's isolated, and he has no challengers, and therefore he's not getting kind of frank advice or somebody that's undermining his assumptions on the fact that this will be quick and this will be painless. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really the fundamental change. It's not that he's turned a madman all of a sudden. He was always a nefarious actor willing to go to any lengths to achieve his aims. It's just that he doesn't have any checks on him. And that's one of the dangers of an authoritarian, autocratic regime.
So how does this end?
That's the real question. It's become so much more complex to see how this ends. Before the war started, you could see ratcheting up deterrence, some sort of graduated response options, some combination of different levers being pulled to avert it. Now in war, with Russia suffering the kinds of casualties it is, and all these pressures coming to bear, Putin's turning into a caged animal. And that becomes very, very unpredictable. I think it's likely to get worse. I think we're going to see some more erratic behavior from Vladimir Putin before he realizes that he actually has increasingly worse options. And he's not a suicidal madman. He has a powerful will to live because he's a egotistical, megalomaniacal individual. So he's going to eventually figure out some sort of off-ramps. He still retains the levers of power, and he's the one that has actually the most flexibility. He could kind of come up with some sort of solution, like the Ukrainians may recognize Crimea and everything else returns to Ukrainian control, except for the fact that the conditions have changed and Ukraine doesn't have to live under the constant threat of Russian attacks. But there are different ways that this could potentially get resolved. I don't think there's going to be, at this point, it's hard to see how the West and NATO get pulled in militarily, but it might go in that direction also. The geometry is just very complex.
Thank you for bringing all of your experience to that conversation, helping us understand, although ultimately isn't it unsatisfactory to know it's very uncertain at this point, the direction. But I do appreciate your helping us understand the issues so well. Thank you for the time. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman.